Well, good morning once again, and today we will be continuing our discussion of Herodotus. I thought that perhaps we would also have time to begin our discussion of Virgil, who is next on our list, but I'm a little bit in doubt about that. We'll see how things progress. What is, I believe, going to change is the extent that we will read from Virgil. I had originally thought that only a certain modest amount of passages would suffice, but then thinking things through with myself, I came to the conclusion that perhaps it would be disrespectful to Virgil, the greatest of all Roman epic poets, that we should read so small a number of passages from what is arguably the greatest Latin epic of all times. So we will devote greater time to Virgil's Aeneid, and I will extend the number of passages that we will discuss from that work. This, of course, will have the natural implications of maybe shortening the list of works that we will discuss, and it will happen at the expense of the Argonautica, which I had hoped we will read, but it seems to me that it would be better to discuss fewer, not that we've discussed few works in all, but it would be better to discuss fewer works in greater detail than a greater number of works in a more superficial manner. So this is what we have to expect. What it really means is that once we begin reading Virgil, this will take us to the end of the semester, which is fast approaching. We are now beginning what seems to me the final third of the semester. It's exactly the last third of the semester, and I believe that devoting it in its entirety almost to Virgil would be a wise decision, and also respectful to the spirit of Virgil. We would not want to annoy him, even though he was reputed to be of mild disposition. Virgil was not likely to be angry in any case. Anyway, what we are going to do today is to resume our discussion of Herodotus, whom we encountered last week. Herodotus, as I said, aptly called by Cicero the father of history, and by others also the greatest of liars. There's a complete essay by Plutarch named on the wickedness or malignity of Herodotus, claiming that he was in fact misleading his readers and so on and so forth. We in general would like to view Herodotus in a more positive way, which of course he deserves. And he has the clear merit of being the first, as we said, who found it worthwhile to record recent events so that the memory of the great workings and accomplishments, both of Greeks and of barbarians, the memory of these things is not lost. So we also said, turn this on, we also said that Herodotus had predecessors in this field, even though none of them really undertook to explain recent events. and none of them saw recent history as worthy of preservation. They focused on usually mythological tales and geography. The most prominent of geographers of the ancient times, the ancient Greek world, was, as we mentioned, Hecataeus of Miletus. Let me show you once again the map. There it is. Yes. So the map of ancient Greece, we said that Herodotus, like all the ancient great Greek writers, did not originate from mainland Greece. He too, like Homer before him, came from Ionia. See this region here, Ionia. And more specifically, from the city of Halicarnassus. So Herodotus of Halicarnassus here, what is today southwestern Turkey, and we said that he traveled widely and that he was conversant with the knowledge of Egypt, Babylon, and also in a more westerly direction, he also reached South Italy. And the information which he gathered was based on hearsay, actual reports from the wise men that he met in his travel. And why is that? Because in the time of Herodotus, there were no libraries in which a scholar could immerse himself. There were no books in great abundance. Of course, no historical books, no history books to consult. So what Herodotus had to do was, in fact, to create. The Latin expression is ab ovo. It really means from the egg, which means from the very beginning, okay? He had to create ab ovo, the discipline of writing history, which is more professionally called historiography, okay? So he was the first historian, and the discipline is called, or the field is called historiography. Those who preceded him were called the logographers. And of course, the geographers. Now, the logographers are those who wrote logoi. In its simplest translation, a logos, in our context, is a story. Or mythographers as well, those who wrote down the myths of ancient Greece, but none of them used what, for that epoch, might be called scientific tools. Scientific tools were, as we also mentioned, the use of judgment in considering the reliability of the information that you received from whoever was willing to give it to you. Now, just a second, let us see the text. Yes. Now, we started reading from the translation that I said was perhaps the most fully annotated version of Herodotus in English. The translation found in the landmark Herodotus, the name of the edition, by the translation by Andrea L. Purvis. And we said that there were several sources of influence on Herodotus in the writing of his work. First of all, the influence of epic. The influence of epic, not just in the choice of subject matter that has to be on a grand scale and that has to deal with historical heroes, not mythical heroes, but a grand story of great impact, a kind of, if you will, a world war or a collision between the greatest powers on earth, much like the great confrontation in the Iliad. And of course, the Odyssey, which spans the entire known world from Troy westwards. So it has to have the historical work has to have a grand scale. And that, of course, comes from epic. Another quality is the manner in which this was conveyed to the public. You must remember that the readership, or perhaps a better word would be the audience of Herodotus, was just that, an audience. An audience is mainly concerned with listening. It hardly needs mentioning that the word audience comes from the Latin verb audio, which means to listen or to hear. And so the work was itself meant to be recited. True, it was not an artistic recitation, as was the case with the Iliad and the Odyssey and the other epics, to, we presume, the accompaniment of a lyre, you know, a lyre like this. It's a form of an ancient harp, okay? So none of that, because this, after all, is prose and not poetry. But the manner of recitation was exactly as the recitation of poetry. Namely, there was an audience gathered to listen to the author reading his or reciting his work. So the literary tradition on which this is founded is oral, as was much of ancient literature in any case. The tragedies, the Athenian audience in the festival of Dionysus, in which were presented all the tragedies and the tetralogies, you know, 3 tragedies, usually of a common theme, followed by a satire play. So these were the tetralogies. A trilogy, that is 3 tragedies, accompanied by a satire play. All of them were acted out in front of the audience. The audience could not then go home and say, oh, okay, that was a great trilogy, I will buy a copy in the Agora next day, because there would be no such copy. We assume, of course, that the actors had you know, the written version of the play, but it was not publicly available in any way that even remotely approaches what we today take for granted. So the whole concept of literature was oral. And this, of course, applies to the history of Herodotus as well. Now, we said that the history itself is a work of really gargantuan scale. In Hellenistic times, it was divided into 9 books. And in this case, we can really call it a book because it is not poetry, it is prose. The Iliad, Odyssey, the Aeneid, and epic poems in general are, as a custom, divided into books. But these are more poetic books. They are like songs. Okay, Herodotus's work is prose, and therefore it is rightly divided into books. We cannot call them chapters because they are of a sizable scope of material, and they are named, as we said, after the 9 muses. Again, the division is not of Herodotus's making, it was in Hellenistic times. And these are the great, this is the great influence of epic poetry on Herodotus, the scale and the subject matter. We also said that there was another influence, and that is the influence of folklore and wisdom literature. And this we see in particular in all those tales in Herodotus where we have a figure of a wise man instructing us, as it were, through, of course, his activity in the narrative, instructing us on what is the correct way to behave, what is it that constitutes a happy life, how to achieve a happy life, and so on and so forth, as we shall see today in the famous story of Croesus and Solon. So this is the influence, albeit a smaller influence, on a smaller scale than the influence of epic, on the nature and character of Herodotus's work. And the third important source of influence was, and perhaps the most prominent of all, the effect of tragedy. Okay, tragedy as, I would say, an inextricable part of life. Okay? Life is tragic, whether we like it or not. More than it is a comedy, it is a tragedy. Perhaps it also depends on your point of view, but as we can infer from Herodotus, tragedy is the course that history follows, and for good or ill. A very common tragic principle is that there is always a sense of balance in the universe. That is, evil and good and evil are in a constant state of strife, and there's always tension between them. And whatever happens, the cosmic balance is going to be retained, more often than not, in ways that we cannot really anticipate. And this, of course, is expressed in miniature in the story, again, of Solon and Croesus and Cyrus, the great Persian king. Why do I say in miniature? Because it is, in a way, a microcosm, that story of Croesus's ambition and final failure. It is, in fact, a microcosm of the grander story of the Persian invasion into Greece, which ended in Persian defeat. Again, it cost many lives, and many famous battles were fought in the course of that great endeavor, which spanned also a lot of years. But in the end, the Persian aspiration to conquer Greece and the Greek polis was cut short and put to an end. When exactly was it? In 479, 78 BC, in the great Battle of Plataea, where nominally the Persians were defeated, and that was the end of the great conflict between Persia and Greece. And it also announced the the great 50 years of classical Athens. It was in those 50 years, from 478 BC to 430 BC, that the great achievements of what we call classical Athens to this day were achieved. The building of the Parthenon, the great tragedians, Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides and Socrates, they were all products of these 50 years, which of course gradually, that was a glory that gradually began to wane, that is to recede in 431, the famous year when the Peloponnesian War began, the Great War, which was to be the subject of the next great historian, Thucydides. The history of the Peloponnesian War, the great conflict of Athens and its allies, and Sparta and its associates, which of course ended in the great demise of Athens. So what we would call classical Athens is in fact a period which is very, very short. It's the 50 years, mainly. When we define, historical periods, it is always dangerous to set definite limits. But if we are required to do so, then those 50 years from the end of the Persian Wars to the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, these are the years of Athens in its heyday, which of course continued, but to a lesser extent and under more strenuous conditions. And how does this combine with Herodotus's work? Well, Herodotus was curious to see what the events were that brought about this great prosperity of Athens and the Greek world. And his answer was to research, the Greek verb is historein, and the noun, of course, as we said last time, is historie. Of course, it's history. Historie in Herodotus's dialect is research. So what, in fact, Herodotus means when he says, I am the first, well, he doesn't say it, but when he says that he is going to present his historie of great human events, is that he is going to present his research, as it says here. Herodotus of Halicarnassus here presents his research so that human events do not fade with time. And research in itself combines the scientific, as it were, tools of that day to judge reasonably the reliability of the information that Herodotus received from his informants. And his informants were, as I said, wise men of the Greek and Eastern world, people who themselves were part or took part in the great wars with Persia, which ended, by the way, 7 years, more or less, after Herodotus was born. Herodotus was born in 485 BC, thereabouts, and died, we assume, 60 years later. So he was 7 years old when the great conflict with Persia came to an end. And as a grown man, an adult, he found it to his purpose to explore how this great conflict came about, because he could tell that the great achievements of Greece were a product of this this peace that was attained at a great cost. So the causes that led them to make war on each other. Okay? And we said also that Herodotus, even though he was a pioneer in the field of history, was not really working just relying on his own knowledge. He had forerunners, and they were the logographers, the mythographers who wrote stories, most of them legends, and geographers. Now, of the geographers, as we said, the most famous and best known to this day is Herodotus of Miletus. Now, Herodotus of Miletus, just a second. Herodotus of Miletus was known to have written or to have drawn a map of the world. This is not the original, which looked more or less like this. Okay, so this is what we would call the circumnavigation of the known world. The part of the, let's say, the circum part of the circumnavigation is very evident in this drawing, because you can see that the disk of land or lands is encircled by the legendary river Oceanus, which I hardly need tell you is our origin for the real ocean or oceans of our globe. But the ancients liked to imagine the world as a disk of lands seen, of course, edge on. We should imagine that this is, seen edge on, like this, as though I were looking at it edge on, from the edge. But this is an overview, so we have the view from above. And of course, this, being a flat disk, was again imagined to be encircled in the form of a globe, of a sphere, by air and the higher elements. And of course, all this dwells where? In the exact center of the universe. No solar system then, the universe. This is the center of everything. And I don't know if it's intentional or no, but you can see Athens being here is right at the center of this map, of this illustration of the known world. And of course, this was accompanied by some written record, an explanation, as it were, of what it is that we see here. So Europe, of course, is the largest of continents. And you have here Asia, which is practically the Persian kingdom. And Africa, also called Libya. But this is Africa, and of course the ancient kingdom of Egypt. Miletus and Ionia over here, and Athens. So this is what they imagined the world to be like. And it was all encircled by the great river Ocean, believed to be the edge of the world here. The Caucasus Mountains were believed to be the edge of the world. That is why Prometheus, whom we remember well, was punished there at the ends of the world. Of course, the later voyagers came to understand that it was not so, but as a product of human ingenuity and the power of the human intellect to make, to extrapolate, to make assumptions on where it is that we are. This, of course, is miraculous because it is, in a certain way, accurate. Well, it does not conform to anything we know today, but imagine those ancient peoples who did not know anything or had no ability to view the continents from above. This is all based on hearsay and actual travels of travelers. And this is the map of Hecataeus, a reconstruction, of course, and this is the world as Herodotus knew it. And in it, of course, the great clash between East and West. There's nothing else. So that is why it is so important. Now, at the beginning of Herodotus' story, just a second, at the beginning of the story, we have, as it were, a rationalization of the conflict. The conflict started not in historical times, that is not in the 50 years that preceded Herodotus' birth. No, the conflict or the rancor, the animosity between East and West began long before in mythical times, and Herodotus' purpose is to show how that came to be. Now, we see that Herodotus is going is trying to explain everything in a rational, let's say, godless way. And by godless, I mean not irreverent of the gods, but not resorting to the gods as a cause. Even though many times in his work we see reference to a kind of preternatural, supernatural power that more or less steers events in human lives. He often says that God is envious of successful people. Now, what does he mean by that? We, of course, cannot reconcile that, such a saying, with scientific tools. It would not be acceptable today, say, for a historian to say, well, why did this general lose the war? Because God willed it so. It is a legitimate claim, but it is not scientific. Why then does Herodotus, claiming to find the real causes, as it were, to events, why does he use such terminology? Because in his world, when he says God, he really means what we would describe by the Greek word ananke, which is necessity. And again, this brings us back to the tragic element, the balance that is to be kept in the world. You cannot be excessively rich without some kind of retribution. In the terms of his world, we would call it, it was the will of some God that made it so. But here, God is in fact synonymous, I would say, with necessity, with ananke. Ananke in Latin transliteration seems something like this. Ananke. If you've read Notre-Dame de Paris, or as it is commonly translated, The Hunchback of Notre-Dame, at the very beginning, Victor Hugo says that etched on one of the walls of Notre-Dame, I believe, were the Greek letters that comprise this word, ananke, necessity. So this, of course, dates far earlier than medieval Paris. And ananke is what rules the cosmos, as it were. It is the spirit of tragedy that we live with every day. But even though Herodotus does resort to such sayings, that is, the god was envious of him, and that brought about his downfall. Despite such utterances, on the whole, we can see in this account that it is strictly I would say, mundane. That is, it is devoid of the miraculous, or the word which we used to describe the mythological frame of mind, the numinous. Remember that word, I'm sure, the numinous. That is, that the world is filled with divinities. Some are even the abstract qualities that are within us, like envy and fear and hope. These were all regarded as gods in mythical times, or in mythical stories and accounts of the world. So the ancient world, shrouded in mythological mist, was full of divinities and was numinous. This account is the exact opposite. It is mundane. Mundane meaning of this world, real, hard existence. And we see, what are we concerned or who are we concerned here with? Traders, merchandise, women, and lust. These elements bring about conflict. Women come to shore and mingle with the Phoenician merchants. They arouse their lust and passion and are, as a consequence, abducted, beginning with the story of Io. And this, again, is to account for Io's arrival in Egypt. The mythical story is that Io was changed into a cow and was pestered by a fly that drove her many miles, first eastward, then southward, and then finally she found rest in Egypt. That is all good and well, but it is a myth. What would square with common sense better? Such a story as this, that Io was in fact a princess. Her name, according to what the Hellenes also say, was Io, daughter of Inachus. And this is the story where the women were standing by the stern of the ship, intent upon their purchases, when the Phoenicians, inciting each other, rushed upon them. The greater part made their escape, but some were seized and carried off. Io herself was among the captives. The Phoenicians put the women on board their vessel and set sail for Egypt. Now, mind you, this account of the, shall we say, mutual abductions of women, once on the part of the Easterners, the Phoenicians, and next on the part of the Greeks. These were all the causes of conflict between the two parts of the world. Now, this is how Io came to Egypt according to the Persians. So again, this account of the mutual abduction or mutual abductions is all according to Persian authorities. So Herodotus here, having used his judgment, finds that the account of the Persian scholars, as it were, is reliable. And again, he continues with the rationalization of the myths of Europa, of Medea, which is better known. That is the account of the Argonautica, the voyage of Argo. Was it really for the purpose of regaining the golden fleece, flayed from a miraculous ram, golden, of course, and a ram that was able to fly and speak when need be? Was that the real cause, and was that the real goal of the voyage of Argo, which again in mythological accounts is said to have been the first ship to have ever sailed the seas? Was that the real purpose? No, it was the will to get retribution, and to do so by yet another abduction of a princess, this time the Princess Medea. There's no mention here, as far as I can see, of her magical powers. In common myth, Medea, although she was very young at the time, perhaps 16, was a great enchantress, a great sorceress, able to enchant the fire-breathing bulls that were set against Jason, and most of all, the terrible dragon that was the keeper of the fleece in the field of Ares, where it was hung on a branch of a tree. So no mention of all these. And when they had finished the business that brought them there, that is the Greeks, they abducted the king's daughter Medea. So the Colchian king sent a messenger to Hellas to demand satisfaction for the abduction and the return of his daughter. The reply was that since they had received no satisfaction for the abduction of Io of Argos, neither would they pay anything to them. So here the demand is not only to return the abductee, but also to give satisfaction, that is a kind of compensation for this shameful act. So up to now, we have mutual abductions and one final retribution now on the part of the East. They say that in the generation following these events, and here Herodotus really follows mythological, shall we say, chronology, because even in the mythological chronology, the voyage of Argo, which, as I just said, we will probably not discuss as such, the voyage of Argo preceded the Trojan War by one generation, so that the heroes of the voyage to Colchis, to regain the Golden Fleece, these heroes were a generation prior to the Trojan War. So in the generation, and here this is the tradition that Herodotus, based on the account of the Persians, follows. They say that in the generation following these events, Alexandros, that is Paris, Alexander, son of Priam, heard the stories and wanted to abduct a wife from Hellas for himself, quite confident that he would pay no penalty, since the other side had not paid either. So again, the, shall we say, demystifying, demythologizing of the story, perhaps the best known of stories in Greek mythology, the Judgment of Paris, based, of course, on the fact that Thetis, the sea goddess, and the mortal Peleus were going to be married, and at the marriage ceremony, all gods were invited except the one which understandably was unwanted. Who was she? Eris, that is strife. You would not want strife as a guest at your wedding or at any other party. So she was not invited. But strife being strife, came uninvited nonetheless. And the story which we already mentioned of the golden apple thrown in the midst of the hall, we presume, saying, "This is to the fairest." And the contest was narrowed down to three goddesses, Hera, Aphrodite, and Athene. And the judge of beauty in this beauty contest was none other than Alexandros. He, of course, accorded the prize or the title to Aphrodite because he was promised by her the love of the fairest of women then living. So see the great distance, the great gap and chasm, I would say, that lies between this story, miraculous as and creative as it is, and this actual account, which seems, as I said, much more mundane, no divinities involved, and much more amenable to common sense. That is, it squares with common sense. We can tell ourselves, well, this is reasonable. Such an event might really have happened. Even though we are completely unsure of the historicity of Alexandros and Helen and all the characters that feature in the Homeric epics. But still, this is a reasonable explanation. And so he abducted Helen. Now, the Hellenes decided that the first thing to do was to send messengers demanding the return of Helen and satisfaction for the abduction. When they made these proposals, they were charged with the abduction of Medea. And besides, they said, how could they expect satisfaction from others when they themselves had neither paid nor surrendered her upon request? So as far as the Easterners, the Trojans, were concerned, it is the fault of the West now. And they only set the balance or set the record straight. We are now on even terms. Up to this point, there have been abductions only from each other. But after this, the Hellenes were largely responsible for offenses, for they began to make war on Asia before their enemies made war on Europe. Now, the Persians think that the abduction of women is certainly an act only unjust men would perform. So there's no difference of opinion there. To abduct anyone, and of course women, is something that no one should do. And if someone does it, he cannot be but unjust. And yet, once they have been abducted, it is senseless to make a fuss over seeking vengeance. Okay, the abduction itself is immoral. It is a crime, an offense, grievous even, but to start a war over it, that is not reasonable. Now here he says something that today no historian or anyone else would approve of, but it is written, "It is the way of sensible people to have no concern for abducted women. It is quite obvious that the women would not have been abducted if they hadn't been compliant." So it is, as it were, to put half of the blame on the women themselves, claiming, well, if you had not been compliant, that is, willing, you would not have been abducted. Which, of course, is a great question as to the abduction of Helen. Did she go willingly with Paris, or was she abducted? There are conflicting versions about that as well. In any case, from that time on, they have considered the Hellenes to be their enemies. For the Persians assume Asia and the barbarian tribes living there as their own. So you could say, well, that case of abduction and war and conflict, grievous as it was, what relation does it have to Persia? Well, the Persians assume Asia and the barbarian tribes living there as their own. So the Persians would include as their own what was then Troy and all the barbarian tribes of the vicinity, which in historical times is exactly what happened. They were all called satrapies. Satrapies were the political units of government under the great Persian Empire. So in historical times, these were all Persian satrapies. And yes, so the Persians assume Asia and the barbarian tribes living there as their own, and anything Hellenic is separate and divergent from themselves. So, just a second. Okay. Now, these are the stories told by the Persians and Phoenicians. I remind you that Herodotus brought the account of the Persians, of those of the East. I myself have no intention of affirming that these events occurred thus or otherwise. So again, it is so remote in time that Herodotus, and he says this in the first person, has no ability. He cannot, and therefore he does not intend either to affirm that the things he has just described occurred this way or otherwise. But he does name the events because they offer a rational explanation of the conflict. But I do know who was the first man to begin unjust acts against the Hellenes. I shall describe him and then proceed with the rest of my story, recounting cities both lesser and greater. So Herodotus was discussing the remote past, the past that is so enshrouded in myth and legend that even though we have just been given a rational account of the events, we cannot say with any degree of certainty whether it was this way, that way, or otherwise. What can Herodotus inform us of with greater reliability? He can inform us of the man who was first to begin the unjust acts against the Hellenes. And that man was King Croesus of Lydia in the 6th century BC. Here, Herodotus is already dealing with something, or with events that are much closer in time to his own times, maybe 100 years before his birth. And this is something that he is more than confident of. I do know who was the first man to begin unjust acts against the Hellenes. I shall describe him and then proceed with the rest of my story, recounting cities both lesser and greater. Now, as we said, the story of Croesus and his rise and downfall is a kind of miniature or a vignette that is a small example, as it were, in a nutshell, of the grander and wider scope of the conflict of Persia and Greece. Because here in Croesus, we also have someone who had great aspirations and who was confident of his own strength and wealth, and came to a very, very sad and humbling end. So this is why he chooses to begin with him. And through the description of the dynasty that led to the birth of Croesus, he will also recount cities both lesser and greater. Why? And this, again, is an instance where Herodotus takes a moment, takes a few lines to inform us of his view of the world. Why is it that he is going to speak of cities that are lesser and greater? We could understand why he'd speak of greater cities, but why of lesser ones? Well, since many of those that were great long ago have become inferior, and some that are great in my own time were inferior before. And so, resting on my knowledge that human prosperity never remains constant, I shall make mention of both without discrimination. So this belief in the changing of the versatility of existence, the constant change is both very common of Herodotus and has also evidence in philosophy. We are all, I am sure, familiar with the famous saying of Heraclitus, that everything is always in a state of flux, and that you cannot step twice into the same river, and that everything is constantly changing. So this is something that also is expressed not just in the physical world, but also in the annals of men, the history of mankind. Resting on my knowledge, it is not a belief or an assumption or a conjecture, it is knowledge that human prosperity never remains constant. And why is it knowledge and not belief or conjecture? Because it can be seen. It was seen, is seen, and will be seen in the future. What was once great is now not great. What was once humble is now uplifted to great prosperity. Therefore, both kinds of cities, kingdoms, and fates, as it were, should be mentioned without discrimination. Now, this, again, is what we would call the credo of Herodotus, the belief that there is no constancy in human affairs, and that whatever happens within the greater frame of a cosmic balance. The great becomes small and small becomes great, and there is always a balance in the universe. It's not that the great will always be in their greatness and the humble in their humility. No, we are in a state of constant flux and fluctuations, and the vicissitudes of fate, that is the ups and downs of our existence, will always be here with us. Now, to begin the genealogy of Croesus, Herodotus resorts to a fabulous tale, which is a great folk tale, in fact, with many folk tale elements, which I did not include in our readings, and that is the story of King Candaules and his wife, with whom he was so in love and in whose beauty he was so confident that he became so insecure that he wanted others to confirm his belief in the great beauty of his wife. And that, of course, led him to do something which was slightly, or not slightly, greatly immoral. And he sought the help of his one of his officers, Gyges. Gyges in Greek, to see for himself whether his queen was the fairest of women, and that could only be accomplished by looking at her in her nudity just before she goes to bed. And they contrive a certain scene where Gyges is to hide behind the door of her bedchamber, and he manages to have a glimpse at her naked body and affirm Candaules's conviction that she is the fairest of women. But unfortunately for Gyges, he was seen by the queen, and she demands, of course, retribution. And as a result of that, she and Gyges conspire to murder Candaules, and this is how Gyges becomes king of, or becomes king instead of Candaules. And this brings the brings about the genealogy of King Croesus, 5 generations later. And why? Because 5 generations later, retribution was to take place for that murder of King Candaules, so that there is always, again, a balance in the universe. That balance was to find expression in the conquest of Croesus by Cyrus, the Persian king. So this is a very, very well-known story that I did not include in our reading. You are, of course, invited to read it for yourselves. It's great reading, great fun. And it is always amusing to think that such a story was included in what was then considered history, research, to be handed down to posterity. Another great story, even greater, is the meeting of Solon and Croesus. Now, so Solon, again, Croesus is the ruler of Lydia. I can show you Lydia on the map. Not on Hecataeus' map, even though it's there also, but let's see it a more realistic and more accurate. There we go. Lydia. This is Lydia. You see? There, at the edge. Lydia, and the capital is Sardis, where Croesus has his palace. Yes, it's Asia Minor, modern day Turkey. Yes, Western Turkey. Yes, Asia Minor, Lydia, the capital is Sardis, and it is there that Solon arrives. Now, the chronology, however you try to resolve it, does not resolve easily, because Solon and Croesus could not have met in real life, but this does not concern us so much, because we are more concerned with the story itself. Solon was archon at Athens in 595 BC, and it is said that he was the author of great reforms, social reforms in Athens. We will not go into that. And he brought about a certain stability in the Athenian society, giving them rules and laws, and making the Athenians swear an oath that they would not change his rules and laws for 10 years. And so that they might not have any recourse to him saying, well, we need this to be corrected and that law changed, and so on and so forth. He quit Athens and went abroad. So the Athenians could not do such a thing on their own, because they had taken, that is, change the constitution, as it were, because they had taken a solemn oath to abide for a period of 10 years by whatever laws Solon would make. For this reason, as well as for sightseeing, Solon went abroad and visited the court of Amasis in Egypt, and also the court of Croesus at Sardis. Now, Solon was even then reputed as a wise man, and he was to be included in the canonical list of the 7 wise men of ancient Greece. And the story we're going to read now is an expression of that other great influence in Herodotus, the influence of the morality story. That is, how a wise man consults a monarch, a ruler, a king, on what is the best way to behave, what is the arete, the excellence, the quintessential characteristic that a good monarch or a good citizen, whoever he might be, should have. And that would designate them as happy. So Croesus gave orders. When he arrived there, he was entertained as a guest by Croesus in the palace. Then on the third or fourth day, Croesus gave orders to his servants to give Solon a tour through the treasuries and to point out all his great riches. When Solon had viewed and inspected everything long enough, Croesus said to him, "My Athenian guest, word of your wisdom and travels has reached us even here. We hear you have wandered through much of the world in the search for knowledge. So I really can't resist asking you now whether you have yet seen anyone who surpasses all others in happiness and prosperity." Again, it is the quintessential folk tale where the great king relies on his wealth, his material assets, his riches to designate him, to make him the happiest of all men living in the world. And I will say that this story also appears in the biography of Solon by Plutarch, who worked 500 years after Herodotus. So this story of the meeting of Croesus and Solon also appears there. If you want to read the biography by Plutarch, you will find it there as well. And of course, Croesus, this scene was also depicted in art. There are many artistic representations of this encounter between Croesus and Solon. Now, of course, this from his point of view was a rhetorical question, the answer being clear: you are the happiest, the greatest in happiness and prosperity of all that I have ever seen. That was the desired response. And mind you, there was a preamble. There were preliminaries that were undertaken to ensure that response, and that is the tour that Solon was given prior to their interview. "Sire, that would be," without hesitation, yes, "that would be Telos the Athenian." Croesus was amazed and questioned him sharply, "Why do you choose Telos?" Solon replied, "For one thing, he lived in a famous city and had good and noble children, and he saw all his children and grandchildren surviving him. Besides, he was well off, at least by our standards of living. So he was not poor, but he was not Croesus of Lydia. He was well off, and he ended his life in the greatest glory." What is that greatest of glories? "For he came to the aid of the Athenians in a battle against their neighbors in Eleusis and forced them to flee before he died most nobly on the battlefield. The Athenians buried him at public expense in the very place he fell and gave him great honors." So this, by all accounts, is very odd indeed. This is the happiest man Solon can think of at that instant. Why? Because, to begin with, Telos was a resident in an illustrious city, a famous city, that is Athens. He lived a long life. He had sons and children and grandchildren who survived him. And he died a noble death, that is, in defense of his city on the battlefield, where he was also buried at public expense. Well, as Solon spoke at length about Telos' happiness and prosperity, he spurred Croesus to ask further. Well, if not first place, then second best would also suffice. Who might be the next most happy man? Croesus was altogether certain he would win at least second place. But Solon said Cleobis and Beton. Now, who were these? These were the sons of an Argive priestess of Hera, who, on a certain day, the priestess was supposed to perform the sacrifice to Hera, and the ritual was that she was carried to the temple in a cart drawn by oxen. But alas, the oxen were delayed in the field. They were still eating grass. They were still grazing in the field. What would happen? How would the tradition be continued? The two loyal and faithful sons, Cleobis and Biton, yoked themselves to the cart and drew their mother a great distance to the temple. Okay? See what filial devotion we have here. They put themselves under the yoke and themselves hauled the wagon with their mother riding in it. For 5 miles, imagine that, until they brought her all the way to the sanctuary. Everyone who had gathered there for the festival watched them perform this feat, and then the god granted the young men the best possible departure from this life, showing clearly that it is better for a human being to be dead than to be alive. Now, this is a bit enigmatic, and it demands some sort of explanation. And Herodotus supplies that explanation. Again, faced with such filial devotion, we would expect great reward to the two sons. And that reward is given by the god to the two young men. So again, they were young, unlike Telos of Athens, who lived to see his children and grandchildren. No, here they were young, and by that reward, the god showed clearly that it is better for a human being to be dead than to be alive. Well, and there are some reservations to that. So the Argive men crowded around them and showered praises on their strength, while the Argive women commended their mother for being blessed with such good sons. Their mother was simply elated by her son's feat and by all the praise. She stood before the statue of the goddess. Remember that we are in the midst of the performance of the ritual to Hera. So she stood before the statue of the goddess and said a prayer for Cleobis and Biton, that since they had shown her such great honor, that the goddess grant to them the best thing a human being could have. So she, I am sure, did not imagine that the gods would come to the conclusion that the best thing for her sons that particular time would be to die. But she asked that they be given the best thing a human being could have. After the prayer, they all sacrificed and had their feast. Then the young men fell asleep in that very sanctuary and never awoke again. This was the end of their lives. That is, they died at the height of their glory. By their death, the gods, or the god, or necessity, or providence showed that Cleobis and Biton could aspire to no greater glory in their lives. And it is best to leave this world when you are at your highest, when you are at your peak, rather than dwindle and gradually deteriorate into nothingness without great glory. So this was the end of their lives. The Argives made statues of them and dedicated them at Delphi to commemorate that they had proven themselves to be the best of men. So Telos died again under the most noble of circumstances, the noblest of circumstances. Cleobis and Beton died after having demonstrated incomparable filial devotion, and these deserve the first two places of being the happiest of mortals. Solon, being rich, arrogant, and impatient, has no intention of being declared the third. So when Solon thus allotted the second place for happiness to these, Croesus now became annoyed. My Athenian guest, he said, are you disparaging my own happiness as though it were nothing? Do you think me worth less than even a common man? And this is the lesson that Solon wishes to teach Croesus, and the lesson I will summarize it, because Solon, being an elderly wise man, has a way of saying things in a roundabout way. He begins by an odd calculation of how many days there are in a person's life, in an average person's life. Well, regardless of the amount of days that are allotted to each and every one of us, we can be sure of this important thing that he says. And any one of these days brings with it something completely unlike any other. Okay, so this is a nice sentence to remember, that we have many days, some more, some less, but we have a certain quota. We must remember that any one of these days brings with it something completely unlike any other. And so Croesus' human life is pure chance. You seem to be very wealthy, and you rule over many people, but I cannot yet tell you the answer you asked for until I learn how you have ended your life. So a man, a human being, according to Solon, can only be called happy if we know for certain that he ended his life in happiness. Otherwise, happiness along the way does not count. It is the end that matters. The end that matters. If you die happy, then you are rightfully called happy as a whole. But if you are happy at a certain period of your life, and then you lost that happiness in tragic circumstances, then by all accounts, you are not only not the happiest of mortals, but rather the most miserable of them. And here he says, for many wealthy people are unhappy, while many others who have more modest resources are fortunate. So it is not material gain and property that would make you happy. There are others of modest means who are fortunate. The man who has great wealth but is unhappy outdoes the unfortunate man in only two ways, while the fortunate man outdoes him in many ways. Again, he explains his principle, but before he dies, refrain from calling him this. One should rather call him lucky. So this is also an answer to those of us who might wonder, but if I am now experiencing happiness, am I not really happy? So no, according to Solon, you are lucky. Happiness is a matter of chance, and real happiness, well, this is not of Herodotus, this is not in Herodotus' account, but real happiness is only a happiness of the soul, what you gain for yourself and cannot be taken from you. And this is also something that is exemplified in many anecdotes, that the wise man has riches within himself. And these are the true riches, the true assets of anyone. Other stuff, well, we can call him, or those who possess them, lucky. Again, for the purpose of the story, it is necessary that Croesus does not understand the message that Solon so aptly wants to convey. He used a story, he used calculations, he used aphorisms like, no one day is similar to the next, and do not call the rich happy, call them lucky. It doesn't work. Croesus does not understand because he is blinded by his arrogance. This is only necessary for the course of fate, for the course of necessity, to come to its conclusion. Solon did not please Croesus at all by telling him this, and Croesus dismissed him, thinking him worthless and extremely ignorant for overlooking the good things right before his eyes and telling him instead to look at the end of every matter. So as far as Croesus is concerned, Solon is a fool not to be looking at the good things in front of you, but instead projecting your sight forward and trying to foresee what will happen. And if you cannot do that, which naturally you cannot, as a result, call anyone happy. So he thought that it was foolish to look to the end of every matter to see how it will turn out. God shows many people a hint of happiness and prosperity only to destroy them utterly later. So after Solon left, the god took a dreadful vengeance upon Croesus, apparently because Croesus had thought himself the happiest and most prosperous of men. So here, once again, we see the balance that is to be retained by fate. And the only way Herodotus has of expressing it is by saying that God took a dreadful vengeance upon Croesus. And apparently the reason was his act of arrogance here. And this, in fact, the vengeance, as it were, of the gods is expressed in two ways. First, one of Croesus's sons dies tragically. And the second is the tragic war that Croesus wanted to wage against Persia. And, you know, the famous oracle that, Croesus, before waging that war, sent an expedition to Delphi to consult the goddess, the Pythia, whether he should or should not wage war on Persia. And the equivocal response that if he should make war on Persia, he would destroy a great kingdom. It is not a literal translation of the Greek, but it is a translation that retains the ambiguity, because Croesus, again, in his arrogance, thought that, well, here the Pythia prophesies that I would conquer Persia. But again, the great kingdom which he destroyed was his own. And the end of Croesus is again an end which finally brings understanding. Tragic understanding, but as we said, and this is again the element of tragedy in Herodotus, that one of the key elements of tragedy is belated understanding. You understand, but it is already too late. So, where is it exactly? Chapter 87 or 86. Okay. When the Persians took Sardis and captured Croesus, so this is already the end. There was a war and the Persians won. He had ruled 14 years and had been under siege 14 days. And as the oracle predicted, he put an end to a great empire, his own. The punishment was for Croesus to be burned alive at the stake. And as Croesus stood there on the pyre, that is the stack of wood on which he was placed and that it was going to be set on fire, despite the horror of his predicament, then he thought of Solon and how divinely inspired he had been when he stated his maxim that no living human can be called truly happy and prosperous. Until then, he had remained quiet. But when this occurred to him, he sighed deeply and groaned and repeated aloud, Solon 3 times. Now Cyrus heard this and ordered his interpreters to ask Croesus, who was this man he had called by name? Croesus kept silent at first, but when they pressed him to answer, he said, a man to whom I would pay a fortune if only he could talk to all tyrants. So only now does Croesus finally understand his great blunder and the disrespect that he showed Croesus. And it all comes back to him, as well as the lesson that he should have learned way back in the past. Now, Cyrus, after learning through the interpreters, mind you, Cyrus and Croesus do not speak the same language. So the importance of translation in this instance is very great indeed. We might assume that the interpreters, the translators, were reliable. So after learning through the interpreters what Croesus had said, reflected. Now Cyrus, unlike Croesus, is wiser. Reflected that he too was human and changed his mind about committing a living man to the fire, a fellow human being who had been blessed with happiness no less than he. Moreover, he began to fear retribution. So what took Croesus a long time and a great loss to understand, Cyrus, in his victory, at his greatest hour, at his finest hour, comes to realize instantaneously. So he gave orders that the fire should be extinguished at once and that Croesus and the Lydian youths with him on the pyre be brought down. The Persians immediately tried to carry out his orders, but they were unable to get the fire under control. So the fire was already burning. Croesus and the others could not be saved. And here we have a miracle. Again, a miracle. Then say the Lydians, as Croesus watched all the men attempting but failing to put out the mounting flames, he realized that Cyrus had changed his mind and now called out to Apollo, beseeching him that if any of his gifts had ever pleased the god, to come now to his rescue and save him from the danger at hand. And as he called on the god, and as he called on the god and began to weep, clouds suddenly converged out of the clear, calm sky, and a storm burst out and rain poured down in floods, extinguishing the fire. Now, Herodotus does not confirm or laugh at this account. It is an account by the Lydians, and also it is a nice ending to this tale of lesson that Croesus learned. Of course, Croesus then is released, and he becomes a counselor to Cyrus, who asks him, "Sire, Croesus, who on earth persuaded you to wage war against me rather than to become my friend?" Croesus replied, "Sire, what I did was a blessing for you, but a curse for me. The one to blame is the god of the Hellenes. It is he who encouraged me to go to war." Now, it is always easiest to put the blame on some supernatural element. In this case, of course, Croesus is blaming Apollo or the Pythia, even though Apollo has just saved him. Otherwise, no one could be so foolish as to prefer war to peace. In peace, sons bury fathers. In war, fathers bury sons. Surely this all happened by divine will. So even though we are discussing history, we end our affair with Herodotus with divine will, because again, this is an example of how there is an order in the universe, how balance is maintained by necessity, by divinity, that rule all of us. So, as I had expected, we did not reach Virgil today, and for good reason, because we will do so next time, and we will begin reading the Aeneid. I will upload the material onto the Moodle, and well, that would be all for today. You're welcome.